You're listening to the Entrepreneur to Author podcast, episode number 26.
Welcome to the Entrepreneur to Author podcast, the podcast that brings you practical strategies for building authority and growing your business. And now, here's your host, Scott McMillan.
It's one thing to write a book and publish it. With that, you'll have accomplished a feat that many business owners aspire to, but few complete. Your book provides a focal point for your business, a lightning rod for activity, for attention, for opportunity. But what happens when you add a second book to the mix? A different title, a different topic, a different reader journey, and possibly even a different ideal reader. Well, that changes things, in many ways for the better. Further credibility, a wider net, more arrows in your quiver. But how do you make sure that you don't lose focus? How can you make sure that you don't go from being known as the go-to authority on a given topic to watering down that authority and being too much of a Jack or Jill of all trades? My guest today has thought deeply about her IP and how it knits together across multiple books. About how her books create a unified brand proposition, while adding dimensions that would be difficult, if not impossible, to achieve with a single title. Whether you're already published and are considering your next title, or you haven't yet put pen to paper on your first book, but know in your soul that you've got more than one book in your future, you do not want to miss this edition of Entrepreneur to Author. My guest today is Dr. Paige Williams. Paige is an author, speaker, researcher, and trusted advisor and mentor to senior leaders across business, government, education, and beyond. She uses a potent blend of neuroscience and psychology to surface uncomfortable truths with leaders and their teams so that they can break through and turn disruption and uncertainty to their advantage. She's the author of Becoming Anti-Fragile, Learning to Thrive Through Disruption, Challenge, and Change, first published in 2020, as well as her new book, Own It, Honoring and Amplifying Accountability. Paige, welcome so much to Entrepreneur to Author. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks so much, Scott. It's just great to be here with you.
Oh, lovely. So let's start by perhaps giving our listeners a little bit more about your background and experience that has led you to what you do today and for whom.
Oh, sure. I'd love to. So my first degree is in business studies, and I spent the first 20 years or so of my career working my way up through various organizations until I was at the most senior leadership levels, had budget responsibility, and perhaps more importantly, had responsibility for lots of people across multiple locations in Europe. And then as I travelled to Australia, I took a shift in direction and got involved in the early days of the field of positive psychology. And that's what led me to my PhD research, where I examined what creates thriving systems, particularly in an organisational context, and really doubled down on leadership because my research showed and my experience told me that actually leaders are the most potent leverage point for positive change in any system. And that's whether that's an organization, whether it's a team, whether it's a family, whether it's a football club, actually doubling down on leadership and really taking a close look at how we're showing up in our own leadership and how we're helping others step into theirs. That's how we have a real possibility to create positive change.
Yeah, that makes complete sense, right? If you address leadership, that has knockdown effects throughout the organization, or regardless of what that organization is. Yeah. So thanks for that. Now, you published your first book, Becoming Anti-Fragile, in 2020. Could you share a little bit about your inspiration for that book?
Yeah, sure. Absolutely. Well, the irony is to write a book about disruption, challenge and change just before the COVID pandemic hits. And so I was in the final stages of it in February 2020 as our journey with COVID started to unfold. And so part of me was like, wow, great, what wonderful timing. But really what led me to write it wasn't the COVID pandemic. In fact, we've had these very deep structural, systemic fragilities growing over a period of time, like for the last 50 years or so, as we've created systems that really psychologically and socially and in terms of our relationships with ourselves and others, they're just growing beyond our capacity to keep up. And so the book really speaks to how is it that we address this fragility. And I came across the idea of anti-fragile actually when I read Mark Manson's book about hope, and he mentions the idea in there. And then I went back to the original work of Nassim Taleb, which is an amazing, very deep read, and doesn't actually very much focus on human systems. And so as I read his work, which is kind of socio-economic and political systems, all I kept thinking was, wow, what could this mean for leaders and teams and organizations to become anti-fragile? And how could I translate what's a very deep and complex idea into something that really was kind of a handbook and a guide that people could use every day? So that was the inspiration behind it.
Yeah. And so now you've just published your second book titled Own It. Could you share a little bit about Own It as well? And who is that written for? And what do you expect that they will get from reading it?
Well, Own It is another passion project. I wrote at the beginning of becoming anti-fragile that I felt compelled to write the book. And I really did through my experience both as a leader and then as I've moved into my practice and working alongside leaders and helping teams to thrive and move towards their best performance. This idea of anti-fragile and moving beyond resilience. I'd taught resilience for so long, but it really wasn't enough. And so anti-fragile takes us beyond that and asks us the question, how can we be better coming out of disruption and change than we were coming into it? And that's different to resilience rather than just bouncing back. But as I did that work and as I've done other, not just with anti-fragile, but as I've been a leader and as I've done other work with leaders and CEOs and their teams, what I've really found is that without accountability, which is the topic of Own It, then nothing sticks. So whether we're looking to develop anti-fragility, whether we're looking to make our transformational change program work, whether we're looking to meet the latest OH&S requirements, unless we've got a good sense of accountability, unless we can understand how to create that first in ourselves and then to ask others to step into their personal ownership, unless we think about what are we doing at a cultural level to create a context that enables accountability, then it's just like flushing water down a drain. All our energy, our resources, all our money, in terms of any of the programs that we might be wanting to put through and create change in our teams and organizations is just a waste. And so I feel like Own It is kind of the upstream book from Anti-Fragile, in that one of the ways that we most often make and keep ourselves fragile is through a lack of accountability and a lack of personal ownership. And so let's do that work first, because once that's in place, anything that comes after it will be more effective.
Yeah, perfect. That makes so much sense. You know, I find that many entrepreneurs have this goal of becoming a published author. And of course, few follow through with it, but fewer still go on to write a second book. So for you, from a business perspective, why did you feel it was important to keep writing and to keep publishing beyond your first book?
Well, I think for me, there's a personal side to this in that I'm someone who is actively involved in research. I like to, expand my own thinking, but also I'm someone who's very pragmatic. So if we're going to work together, then I want that work to actually make a difference. And coming out of Anti-Fragile and having published a book about thriving through disruption and challenge and change in the middle of a pandemic, it was important that the work was effective. It was important that the work made a difference. And yet this issue around accountability and personal ownership, which is always a challenge, but particularly so when we're being stretched in many directions as we have been during the pandemic. So how can we call people to account? This is one of the central things I talk about in the book, is that accountability has so much been used as a punitive form of punishment. When we want to have an accountability conversation, generally it's not because things are going well, it's often because things are going off the rails in some way. And yet, actually, if we reset accountability and we move it from that punitive tool of punishment to one that's actually about setting us up for success, if we step into our own ownership over having the right conversations at the right time with the right people, then that can make all the difference, even as we might be spinning 1,000 plates and feeling not at our best, feeling overwhelmed with the things that are going on in our context. And so Own It is an invitation to actually shift our perspective around accountability from one of punishment to one that comes from a place of love, where we're actually saying to people, I see you can play a bigger game. I've got faith in you. Let's do this together. It's a real partnering process. So it's an invitation to something completely different. And even as we've navigated the COVID, the pandemic, and continue to do so, accountability is going to be crucial as we come out the other side as much as it was going in.
Yeah, that's one thing that I really love about the title is, to your point, accountability has, for whatever reason, is probably not legitimate, but it has a negative connotation. But when you say own it, whether it's I'm going to own it, I want you to own this, it just completely changes how it's received, doesn't it?
It absolutely does. And it comes from that place of invitation. It comes from that place of partnering and let's have conversations about this. And throughout the book, I talk about accountability and responsibility from two perspectives, from the person asking for it, the accountor, and the person being asked for it, the accountee. And so there are different tools and strategies that we can use so that we get really productive, fair, effective accountability conversations going. And the first piece of that is for us to own what's ours to own in the situation that's going on for us. And so that's why Own It is absolutely the first piece that we have to do in order to then be able to engage in conversations and create contexts that are clean and clear in terms of the accountability that we're asking of others.
Yeah. So there's a clear hierarchy in terms of the IP, and I'd love to talk about the IP a little bit, the intellectual property. So now you've got 2 books published. You've got sort of 2 brands in the market. How do you think about these brands and the role that they play in your business? Do they work together? Do they serve different purposes? Are they subservient to your overall personal brand? Can you share how you think about that a little bit?
Yeah, sure. So I think that the one thing I would say is that this is an evolving process. So when I wrote Anti-Fragile, I absolutely wrapped my whole practice around the ideas in Anti-Fragile. And it's what's beautiful and what really drew me to the idea was that it's a really big, expansive idea. So within becoming anti-fragile, I suggest there are 6 principles, the robust principles that help us become anti-fragile. We could take a deep dive into each of those and spend kind of 2 or 3 months just exploring those together. And then I talk about anti-fragile energy, attitudes, and mindsets. And again, we could spend time deep diving into each of those. And then at the end of the book, I talk about from becoming anti-fragile to being anti-fragile, where we move from it being a set of tools and strategies to it being an inherent part of our identity. And again, there's a 12-month kind of period of work that we could do together if I were coaching you, Scott, where we moved through the different aspects of the book. So the one thing is that I would say that, at the time I wrote Anti-Fragile, I wrote it, and what it afforded me from a commercial perspective was lots of opportunities and avenues to work with individuals, with teams, with whole organizations at different levels of depth, and also being able to really go narrow on one of the topics in the book, or take a broad overview of what does it mean to go beyond resilience and just kind of a light touch on Anti-Fragile. Now, in the 2 years since I've written the book, my thinking's evolved, my practice has evolved. I've recognized this piece and got passionate about this piece around accountability. So that's the next book, but both of them are nested within my practice branding, which is Let's Go There. And so if you like, my overall branding is, okay, let's have these, let's talk about these uncomfortable truths, whether it's that actually you're making and keeping yourself fragile, or whether it's that you've got accountability issues in your team and that's what's fueling this epidemic of underperformance that you're experiencing. These are not comfortable conversations that teams and individuals necessarily want to have. And yet I know from my lived experience as a leader and from working alongside most senior leaders and teams that these are the conversations that make the difference. These are those breakthrough moments. And so from a commercial point of view, if we look at kind of the hierarchy of it, let's go there. Uncomfortable truths, dangerous conversations, inspiring insights is my practice branding. And then nested within that is anti-fragile and own it as two kind of subsets of what the flavor of those conversations could look like. And that then kind of cascades into programs with CEOs, leadership teams, whole organizations, keynote speaking, etc., etc.
Yeah, I got it. That's a really thoughtful way to think about it, Paige. Thank you. Now, how do you use your books in your business?
So there's kind of an input and an output version side of the way that books interact with the practice. So they're available for sale, at all good bookstores and online. And of course, for some people, that's their first contact with me is that they will see the book and buy it, and then they might then join my newsletter list, and they might then join a webinar. I generally hold a webinar at least once a month on one of the topics, either anti-fragile or accountability. And so that's how they become kind of part of my community. Sometimes that will also lead to a piece of corporate, professional work. So not just an individual, but that individual might be a purchaser within an organization. They might be in HR, they might be a leader, and they've recognized that actually, do you know what, can you come and work with my team, or can you come and work with me? I want some coaching on this. And so that's where books can be kind of inbound in terms of feeding the practice. They're great, I think. So that's a small part of it, though. What books mainly are about positioning. So let me get that clear and out there. Number one is I write a book and I self-publish, and it's to get positioning in the market. So to be known for something. So I am now known as the person who does anti-fragile. Other than Nassim Taleb, who wrote the original book, if I don't often Google myself, but if you do Google Dr. Paige Williams, it comes up as anti-fragile. That was the purpose of that book, was for positioning and leverage. And so now, I've got Own It that's coming into the space as well. And so in 12 months' time, I would hope that I'm just as high up if you Google accountability or owning or, ownership, personal ownership, as I am with anti-fragile. So let's say, first and foremost, books are about positioning and getting known for something. Secondly, they provide an inbound sales opportunity because people can find you through your book. And then thirdly, I'm now at the point where for any programs that I do, I will provide, if they're the bigger programs, I will provide an ebook copy of whichever book is appropriate. And what that saves in my practice was I used to spend lots of time producing kind of playbooks and workbooks to go along with the programs. But now, even if it's a program over a period of time and it only might cover an aspect of anti-fragile or an aspect of Own It, I'll still provide the whole book. One, because it saves me time producing a playbook, and also because there's a generosity to it that actually is worth it has more value than the dollar value of an ebook. And so for me, that's also where the books come into play, is that they add value to my other offerings in a way that I couldn't otherwise do.
Yeah, perfect. Let's shift gears for a little bit. I'd love to talk a little bit about your writing process. So what's your process for getting from idea to completed manuscript? And did you find that changed at all from one book to the next?
So yes, it changed significantly. I use Kelly Irving, who's a fabulous book coach. And when I first wrote Becoming Anti-Fragile, I wrestled with that process. I kind of pushed back against it the whole way through, and I wanted to do it my way. And Kelly was super patient with me, and it was like, no, let's just do it this way, because I've done it with a few people before and it really works. So I trusted the system and did what Kelly suggested, and it worked beautifully. And so the process is that not to give Kelly's magic away, but basically the whole book is written in bullet points before you actually sit down to write any prose. And this is absolute gold. Let me tell you, I hate writing. I'm just going to put it out there. I hate writing. But what I do is I build up so much, I've got to write, that, I never quite actually get to doing it. Whereas Kelly's process hacks through that, because you do all of your thinking before you actually sit down to write a chapter. And so at any point when I wasn't feeling like I wanted to write, but I knew I needed to keep up with the production schedule, then I would just pick up, okay, what's the next section? What are the 5 or 6 bullet points I'm covering in this section? Okay, it's 500 words. I can do that. I can do 500 words on those 5 bullet points. And invariably, once I'd done those 500 words, I was in my groove and I could keep going. Kelly Irving is great. Big shout out to her. But also, if you are on this journey without a book coach, the idea of actually doing all of your thinking first, getting bullet points for getting the overall structure, and then going through each section of your chapter and getting the bullet points down, so that actually then when you come back to write your manuscript, you might tweak a few as you go, but the main thinking is done, and it feels you're much more able to kind of get into the flow of writing, is my experience.
Yeah. That's really the key, isn't it, to getting rid of writer's block, is having a plan up front. And if somebody's listening and you're not familiar with Kelly, I'm a huge fan of Kelly. Check out episode 19, I believe it is. Kelly and I had a great conversation. You can learn more about her process. But from a publishing perspective, Paige, you've been through the process now twice. What did you find surprising or frustrating or confusing about the process of going from manuscript to books in hand? And did that change at all from one book to the next?
I'll tell you what I found joyful was having an editor. How fabulous is having someone else read your work? I mean, that is just such a gift, because you get too close to it and then the editor comes back and is like, is able to see with clear and clean eyes what you are wanting to say, or is able to come back and say, what are you trying to say here? Which is equally valuable. I don't think I found anything surprising about the process. And in terms of, you just need to, I remember the first time I went through it, I was like, I know nothing. I don't know how this works. I've never done this before. And actually recently there's been a book produced called It's Your Book. I think it's come out in the last 4 weeks or so, and it does literally step you through every step of the way of publishing a book. And your beautiful book as well, Scott, takes us through this. And I just so wish I'd actually read one of those before I went through the process. That would have been super useful. So I don't think I found anything surprising about the publishing process, just that it's actually complex. So I would say to anyone listening, if it's your first time, do have a look into it so that you understand the overall process. Because I didn't, and it was a bit like fumbling in the dark, to be honest. But I had beautiful people supporting me, like you, Scott. So we got there successfully.
I appreciate that. Yeah, it can be a very a little bit of an opaque process. There are a lot of moving parts, so that makes a lot of sense. Look, before we wrap up, I'd like to come back to your new book. What I find so authentic about a book like Own It is that the journey that you take your reader on is so aligned with the journey that you help leaders and teams through when you work with them directly. I'd love if you could let our listeners know what type of reader is really going to get the most out of this book, and where should they go to learn more about it and about you?
Thanks so much, Scott. So Own It is really for people who are perhaps frustrated by a lack of progress at work. They feel like they're the only ones who show up and do what needs to be done. It's for leaders who there's nothing kind of going really wrong in their team, but there's just not the traction, there's not the forward momentum, because the challenge with accountability is that it kind of sits under the surface and it slips through the cracks. And often when people come and talk to me about us working together, they'll come to me with a surface level symptom, but actually what sits underneath it are issues with accountability. And so really this is for anyone who's feeling frustrated, feeling not listened to, feeling like there's something going on. We're not doing and we're not achieving all that we could, but we're not quite sure why, because on the surface, everyone's looking okay. Those kinds of situations are where Own It and my work can help. particularly if you've got sticky dynamics where there's what I call a culture of politeness, where everyone's showing up and smiling and being plastic fantastic, and no one's actually saying what needs to be said. So those are the kind of scenarios where I know I can really make a difference and help things move forward in a productive and effective and clean and clear way.
Yeah, and would your website be the best place for people to go to get in touch with you?
Yeah, absolutely. So drpaigewilliams.com, that's where you'll find information about me, about the work that I do, and also both books, Becoming Anti-Fragile and Own It.
Fantastic. Well, we'll put that link in the show notes. Listen, thank you so much, Paige. This has been really great to talk to you and learn about your entrepreneur to author journey and how your publishing strategy links into what you do and how you serve your audience. So thank you again for joining us.
Thank you so much, Scott. It's been great to be here with you.
I know. For those of you who haven't yet published a book, the thought of writing 2 may be overwhelming. But I assure you, once you've been through the process once, you'll see just how much you grow personally and how it impacts your business and how people perceive you. But first things first, focus on getting your first book written, and the rest will fall into place. As we wrap up this episode of Entrepreneur to Author, remember this. Publishing more than one book can be an effective way to position or reposition yourself in the market. It can add more depth or breadth to the expertise that you've already built with your first book. Although multiple books have the potential to complicate brand hierarchy, thinking of books as sub-brands of an overarching brand is a very effective way to benefit from multiple titles. And remember, detailed planning is what beats writer's block. If you've already fleshed out detailed bullet points for your entire book, then you'll never have to wonder what you're going to write next. Now is the time. Time to write, time to publish, and time to grow. I'm Scott McMillan. Until next time.